Well, we heard tonight from several different people about their hopes for our movement. How do you, in the UK and in Europe, how do you see the US peace and justice movement? What does it mean for your movement?
To me, being here this weekend is inspiration, and I want to say a big thank you to all those people that have invited me here, but also the discussions that I've had. Because the image that's given in Britain of the anti-war movement of the US is that it is small and not terribly relevant. I know the opposite to be the case. I know that US public opinion has moved very, very fast against the war in Iraq, and that you're on a high, on a roll, and we're going to win. We have had at various times exactly the same problems in Britain, where we're described as marginal. How you can be marginal when you can put over 1 million people on the streets of London, which constitutes a very high proportion of the population. I'm not quite sure. But what I do know is that we need to build the closest possible day-to-day working relationships. Because being in the British Parliament is interesting, it's often very complicated, it's sometimes very lonely, but it's always stimulating. And the British parliamentary system is very different to the US system in many, many ways, in that Parliament and government in Britain are much the same thing, in that all ministers have to be members of Parliament, whereas the opposite is the case in the US. We do have an anti-war group in Parliament, we do have a CND group in Parliament, and a number of us do our best all the time to continually raise the issue of Iraq. And we have a system that's euphemistically known as balloting for questions. It really means a lottery, where you put your name down. If you come up in the first 6, then you get to ask a question to Tony Blair once a week. Tony Blair leaves office on Wednesday. The reason he leaves office is nothing to do with age, nothing to do with infirmity, nothing to do with anything like that. It is because of Iraq. It's because we followed Bush. That was the reason he's leaving. And I wanted to particularly commemorate his last day in office, and it's all very carefully choreographed. He comes into Parliament at 12 o'clock on Wednesday, answers questions for half an hour, and gets in a car and goes to see the Queen, because we live in a monarchy. You remember that. You had one once. He then tenders his seals of office, and Gordon Brown takes over. So I thought, I'll give it a go. I applied for a question to Blair, and I've got one. So his last day, he was asking yet another question from me and others on when are the troops coming home from Iraq.
Some of those things we still live in a monarchy. It's one of the more polite terms that we use for our administration.
Well, Bush is actually related to the royal family distantly. I've been looking him up. Yeah.
It's Poodles or something, isn't it?
Well, it's real. He comes from an old monarchist family. There's 2 branches to it. One of them stayed and became farmers in Northamptonshire. The other one came here.
Too bad they didn't both stay. Now, let's talk a little bit about this notion of being in a parliament where there's actual representation of people. That's something a little bit strange as a concept for us. We don't really have such a concept. But I wonder if when you look at the US Congress, with that divergence from the administration and with all the problems that we know about of the US Congress being elected on the basis of a very flawed democracy, far more flawed, I would say, than yours. Whatever problems there are in Britain, I think they pale next to the flaws of our democracy. How do you see the lessons that we might be able to glean from your experience in the parliament in this scenario where your government is waging an unpopular war? What can we learn from that here about how we might look differently at our Congress and figure out different ways perhaps of raising pressure on our Congress?
Well, they are different. They are different systems, and they both have flaws. The flaws in the US system are the vast amounts of money involved in the election, the corporate interests that have huge domination, and the nature of the political parties. That's all for sure. The British system is not perfect by any manner of means. There are smaller constituencies. Mine is average size, 60,000, inner city, multi-ethnic, multilingual community. In Parliament, it's like a club. It's like a sort of gentleman's club, which unfortunately carries on in many of those awful traditions. And it has with it the incredible power of patronage of the office of Prime Minister. The leader of parties, or the leader of government, in case of Prime Minister, appoints all ministers and all secretaries of state, not answerable to Parliament for the appointments. They have something called the royal prerogative, get the word, royal prerogative they can use to take the country to war or not, or sign treaties or not, as the case may be. And having been in Parliament since 1983, when I was first elected, my party, the Labour Party, was committed to nuclear disarmament, and you couldn't move for MPs wearing CND badges. I'm the only one, I think, that still wears a CND badge in Parliament. I'm not the only supporter of CND, but I've seen people being sucked away by the proximity of power, by the promise of office, and in return to drop the principles that they're there from. What makes politics work is not necessarily what goes on in the Congress or the Senate or in the British Parliament or any other parliament. What makes it work is the effectiveness of accountability outside, is the way in which you demand things of your representatives, the way in which you hold them to account for what they do. We had this discussion in the workshop this afternoon about congressional tactics and representatives. I think you have to ask of every MP. They all voted for the war in the British Parliament. We were given a vote on that occasion, just like your congressmen and senators are. What contribution have you made to history that you've ordered troops into an illegal war that has cost the lives of nearly 750,000 people, sent that country back decades and decades, left a residue of depleted uranium weaponry, unexploded cluster bombs, a destroyed health service, a destroyed education service, and the most unbelievable bitterness all around the world? What is your contribution that you're taking us into the 21st century, into a century of unwinnable war after unwinnable war after unwinnable war to gain the ever-depleting natural resources of this planet? The way forward is to share those resources, respect international law, respect people, and stop waging war and wasting resources on it.